You think down-home Tennessee suppers were just fried chicken and biscuits every night? That's not how most kitchens actually ran. Across Tennessee, from coal towns in the east to river counties in the west to factory neighborhoods outside Nashville, supper was shaped by long workdays, garden rows, smokehouses, and whatever the season allowed. These weren't special occasion meals. They were what got cooked on regular nights, when everyone was tired and supper still had to happen. A lot of these suppers aren't fading because they aren't good. They're fading because they take time. They don't come with instructions on a box, and because no one thought to write them down. So let's keep them alive. 1. Chicken and dumplings. Tennessee style. Tennessee chicken and dumplings were nothing like the fluffy drop biscuits you see today. These were rolled dumplings, thin and wide, cut by hand and simmered directly in broth that had been going all afternoon. Most kitchens started with a whole hen, not parts. The chicken simmered low while the house filled with that unmistakable smell that meant supper was decided hours ago. The dumplings were rolled out on the same counter that had already seen biscuits that morning, often dusted with flour that never quite got wiped clean. This dish mattered during the Depression, but it stayed popular well into the 60s and 70s because it stretched meat without feeling stingy. In Tennessee households, dumplings weren't filler, they were the point. Thick, soft, and tangled together in the pot, they soaked up every bit of broth. When it hit the table, nobody rushed it. Bowls were filled carefully, steam rising, and it always felt like a meal that slowed the whole house down. 2. Pinto beans with chow and cornbread. This wasn't a side dish, this was supper. A pot of pinto simmered most of the day, often with a ham bone saved specifically for this purpose. In many Tennessee homes, beans cooked on Monday were eaten through Wednesday, getting thicker and deeper as the days went on. What made the meal complete was what came with them. Cornbread baked in a heavy skillet, crust dark around the edges. Chow spooned on top, sharp, sweet, and vinegary, cutting through the richness of the beans. This was common in both rural and working-class town households because it was dependable. You could count on dried beans even when the garden failed or money ran tight. And nobody apologized for serving it. People looked forward to bean night. Today we treat this like nostalgia food. Back then, it was just how supper worked. 3. Country ham with red-eye gravy. Country ham wasn't an occasional indulgence in Tennessee. It was a cornerstone. Salt-cured, smoked, and hung for months. It showed up in thin slices, fried slow, with a skillet that had to be scraped clean afterward. Red-eye gravy came from that moment. Hot coffee poured into the pan, lifting every browned bit from the bottom. It wasn't thick, and it wasn't fancy. It was sharp, dark, and poured sparingly over ham or sopped up with bread. This supper showed up when somebody important was home, or when there was time to do it right. It carried deep Appalachian influence, especially in eastern Tennessee, where preservation skills mattered as much as recipes. You didn't need much else on the plate. Just ham, gravy, and maybe greens. And everyone knew you were eating something that took planning before it ever hit the stove. 4. Fried pork chops with milk gravy. These pork chops weren't thick or breaded the way restaurants serve them now. They were thinner, seasoned simply, and fried until the edges curled just slightly in the pan. The real work came after. A little flour stirred into the drippings, then milk added slowly, turning scraps and fat into gravy. This wasn't measured. It was judged by feel, by color, by how it coated the spoon. This supper showed up in Tennessee kitchens throughout the 1950s and 60s, especially in homes where pork was easier to come by than beef. It was filling without being flashy, and it always came with something to soak up the gravy: biscuits, mashed potatoes, or even plain white bread. You knew it was going to be a quiet evening when this was on the table. No rushing, no small portions. 5. Stack cake supper, not just dessert. In parts of Tennessee, stack cake wasn't reserved for celebrations. It sometimes was the meal. Thin layers of spice cake stacked with dried apple filling, cut into thick wedges and served alongside a glass of milk or coffee. In households where baking happened weekly, this cake could stretch several days. The apple filling came from apples dried the previous fall, rehydrated and cooked down slowly. Nothing about it was rushed. And because it kept so well, it became practical. Something you could slice when cooking another full supper wasn't in the cards. It blurred the line between dessert and dinner in a way modern kitchens don't really allow, and nobody questioned it. If stacked cake was on the table, that was supper. 6. Skillet-Fried Liver with onions. This supper showed up more often than people like to admit now. Calf liver or beef liver was sliced thin, soaked briefly, then dredged in flour and fried fast in a hot skillet. The onions went in next, cooking down until they softened and picked up every browned bit left behind. In Tennessee households, this meal wasn't served as a dare or a punishment. It was practical. Liver was affordable, widely available, and considered nourishing, especially for growing kids and working adults. You didn't talk it up. You just cooked it right and moved on. It usually came with mashed potatoes or fried potatoes, something sturdy enough to handle the gravy made from the pan drippings. The smell alone told you exactly what night it was. This is one of those suppers that disappeared quietly, not because it didn't work, but because it didn't fit modern tastes shaped by convenience and packaging. 7. Tomato gravy with biscuits. Tomato gravy wasn't something you ordered. It was something you ended up with when tomatoes were ripe and the pantry wasn't full. Fresh tomatoes were chopped or stewed, then thickened with flour and seasoned simply. No sugar, no herbs, no extras. Just a savory gravy spooned hot over split biscuits. This dish showed up in Tennessee kitchens during summer and early fall, especially in households that canned tomatoes by the dozens. It could stand alone as supper or sit alongside eggs, bacon, or leftovers from earlier in the week. It wasn't flashy, and it didn't try to be, but it filled the house with that unmistakable cooked tomato smell that meant someone had been in the kitchen a while. Today, tomato gravy feels like a secret recipe. Back then, it was just what you made when the garden told you to. 8. Chicken pie with hand-cut crust. This wasn't pot pie, and it wasn't casserole. Tennessee chicken pie usually meant cooked chicken chopped fine, mixed with gravy, and baked under a single layer of crust. Sometimes top only, sometimes bottom only, depending on how much dough there was. The crust mattered. Rolled thin, cut by hand, and laid carefully over the filling, it soaked up steam and gravy as it baked. No decorative edges, no lattice, just function. This supper showed up when there was leftover chicken, but not enough enthusiasm to serve it plain again. It made yesterday's meal feel new without pretending it was something else. Chicken pie disappeared when convenience foods took over that role. But nothing replaced the feeling of cutting into that crust and seeing the filling hold together just enough to serve clean. 9. Fried apples with salt pork. This was supper when meat was scarce or being saved for something else. Salt pork was diced and rendered slowly, then sliced apples were added to the fat, cooking down until soft, slightly browned, and deeply savory. Sometimes a pinch of sugar went in, sometimes it didn't. This dish had deep Appalachian roots and lingered in Tennessee kitchens well into the mid-20th century. It made use of preserved pork and stored apples, turning them into something that felt intentional instead of improvised. It was often served with cornbread or Hoecakes, something to mop up the pan. The sweet-salt balance made it memorable, even for people who didn't expect to like it. You don't see this much anymore, but it tells you everything about how earlier kitchens worked. Nothing wasted, nothing rushed. 10. Hoecakes with molasses. Hoecakes were fast food before fast food. Cornmeal, mixed with water or milk, shaped by hand, and cooked in a hot skillet or on a griddle. No leavening, no waiting, just batter and heat. Molasses was poured on generously, soaking into the cakes while they were still warm. Sometimes butter joined it, sometimes that was all there was. This supper showed up in Tennessee households when time or energy was low, but cooking still happened. It was common in rural areas, but it crossed class lines because it worked. Hoecakes weren't meant to impress. They were meant to get food on the table now. And somehow that made them comforting in a way packaged meals never quite manage. 11. Skillet-Fried Cabbage with sausage or ham. This was a supper built around one pan and no patience for fuss. Cabbage was sliced thick and dropped straight into a hot skillet, usually with leftover ham pieces or sausage coins browned first. As it cooked, it softened just enough to tangle with the meat, picking up salt and fat along the way. In Tennessee kitchens, this dish showed up when the weather turned cool, and cabbage was cheap and plentiful. It wasn't boiled into submission. It was cooked hot and fast, edges catching just a little color. Served with cornbread or biscuits, it filled the house with a smell you either loved immediately or learned to appreciate. Either way, it meant supper was simple and done. This kind of meal didn't survive the shift toward lighter cooking, but it fed generations without apology. 12. Beef and gravy over white bread. This wasn't roast beef. It was chopped beef, simmered low, then ladled over slices of plain white bread laid right on the plate. The bread mattered, soft, square, store-bought. It soaked up the gravy and held the meat in place without turning soggy too fast. No toast, no crust trimming. This supper showed up when there wasn't enough meat to serve on its own. It was common in Tennessee homes during the post-war years, when families stretched beef carefully but still wanted it to feel like a real meal. People ate it with forks, not hands, quietly. It didn't look like much, but nobody left the table hungry. Today, it feels unusual. Back then, it was just another way to make supper work. 13. Scrambled eggs with fried potatoes and onions. Eggs weren't just for breakfast. In Tennessee households, scrambled eggs showed up at night when the pantry was thin or the day had run long. They were cooked slow, not dry, often in the same skillet that had already handled potatoes and onions. The potatoes were sliced thin and fried until tender, onions cooked down until sweet. Eggs went in last, folding gently into whatever was left in the pan. This was a dependable supper, affordable, fast, and satisfying without needing a plan. It worked for families with kids and for adults coming home late. It disappeared not because it wasn't good, but because eggs got boxed into one part of the day. That never made sense in kitchens that knew better. 14. Cornbread and Milk supper. This meal didn't need a stove after baking. Cornbread was crumbled into a bowl, then cold milk poured over it. Some added salt, some added sugar. Some insisted on buttermilk only. This was common across Tennessee, especially in rural homes where cornbread was baked nearly every day. It could be supper, dessert, or something eaten standing at the counter when no one felt like cooking again. It was quiet food, personal food. Everyone had their own bowl and their own way of doing it. You don't see this anymore because it doesn't photograph well and doesn't come with instructions. But it fed a lot of people who didn't need convincing. 15. Baked chicken with rice and gravy. This wasn't a recipe you followed. It was a method you knew. Chicken pieces baked low until tender, rice cooked separately, or sometimes right underneath, gravy made from pan drippings and poured over everything at the table. This supper showed up on Sundays that didn't feel special enough for a full spread, but still deserved something steady. It was common in Tennessee households through the 1960s and into the 70s. Nothing was seasoned heavily. Salt, pepper, patience. That was enough. It disappeared as meals became more segmented and less shared. But when it was on the table, everyone understood what kind of evening it was going to be. 16. Milk-Braised pork chops. These pork chops never touched a grill. They were browned lightly in a skillet, then settled into a shallow bath of milk and left to simmer until the meat softened and the liquid thickened into a pale, savory gravy. No rushing it. The heat stayed low and the lid stayed on. This was common in Tennessee homes where pork was reliable and nothing went to waste. Milk braising stretched flavor and tenderness without needing stock or extra seasoning. What came out of the pan didn't look impressive, but it carried comfort in a quiet way. It was usually served with boiled potatoes or rice, something neutral to catch the gravy. People ate slower when this was on the table. You don't see this much anymore because it asks for patience, and patience doesn't come packaged. 17. Stewed tomatoes with bread and bacon. Fat. This supper depended entirely on timing. Tomatoes were peeled, chopped, and simmered down with a spoonful of bacon fat saved from breakfast. Day-old bread was torn into pieces and stirred in just before serving, thickening the pot into something between soup and stew. This dish showed up in Tennessee kitchens during peak tomato season, especially in households that canned heavily and cooked fresh while they could. It wasn't meant to be pretty, it was meant to use what was there. Served hot, often with cornbread on the side, it tasted like summer stretched just a little longer. It vanished as store-bought sauces took over. But nothing quite replaces tomatoes cooked this way, with bread doing the work instead of starches from a box. 18. Skillet meatloaf with pan gravy. This wasn't baked in a loaf pan. Tennessee skillet meatloaf was shaped by hand, laid directly into a hot pan, and cooked slowly so it held together without drying out. The outside browned just enough to leave behind drippings for gravy. This version mattered in homes without large ovens or where heating the whole kitchen wasn't worth it. It cooked faster and stayed moist, and the gravy came naturally. It was usually served with mashed potatoes or green beans, nothing elaborate. Just a full plate and no leftovers worth saving. Once ovens became central and recipes standardized, this version quietly disappeared. But anyone who ate it remembers the difference. 19. Fried corn with bacon grease. This wasn't creamed corn, and it wasn't boiled. Fresh corn was cut straight from the cob, scraped for the milk, and fried slowly in bacon grease until it thickened and darkened just slightly. Salt was added at the end, nothing else. This dish showed up in Tennessee kitchens when corn was at its best, and meals leaned heavily on what the garden produced. It could be a side, but more often it stood in as supper with bread and maybe sliced tomatoes. It took attention. Corn burned easily and you didn't walk away from the stove while this cooked. It disappeared because it didn't scale well. But when it was done right, it carried more flavor than anything poured from a can. 20. Biscuits and gravy for supper. This wasn't breakfast for dinner as a novelty. It was just supper. Biscuits were baked fresh, gravy made from sausage or pan drippings, and plates were filled without ceremony. This meal showed up when work ran late or energy ran low, but cooking still happened. In Tennessee homes, nobody joked about it. It was warm, filling, and dependable. Kids didn't ask questions. Adults didn't apologize. You don't see this much anymore because biscuits moved into the freezer aisle and gravy into packets. But when both were made by hand, this meal carried more weight than it gets credit for. 21. Pan-fried river fish with cornmeal. This supper depended on who had been near the water recently. Catfish, bream, or crappie were cleaned, dredged in cornmeal and fried hot in a shallow pan. No batter, no seasoning beyond salt and maybe pepper. The fish cooked fast, skin crisping just enough to hold together. In Tennessee, especially near rivers and creeks, this was common well into the 1970s. It wasn't framed as a hobby meal or a special outing. It was food that came home the same day it was caught. Served with sliced onions, beans, or fried potatoes, it felt fresh in a way store-bought food never quite matches. You ate it while it was hot, because that's how it was meant to be eaten. As fewer people fished for supper instead of sport, this kind of meal quietly faded from weeknight tables. Chapter 22. Tomato and egg skillet supper. This dish lived somewhere between breakfast and dinner, and no one cared which. Tomatoes were stewed down in a skillet. Then eggs were cracked right into the sauce and cooked gently until just set. The yolk stayed soft, blending into the tomatoes when broken. This showed up in Tennessee kitchens during tomato season, especially in homes where eggs were always on hand. It didn't require planning or precision, just attention. Usually served with biscuits or toast, it was filling without being heavy. People ate it slower, scooping carefully to keep the eggs intact as long as possible. It disappeared when eggs got boxed into morning meals. But it worked just as well at night, and everyone knew it. 23. Smothered cube steak with onions. Cube steak was never meant to be cooked fast. In Tennessee kitchens, it was browned lightly, then smothered in onions and gravy and cooked low until tender. The goal wasn't crisp edges, it was softness you didn't have to fight with a knife. This supper showed up when beef needed help. Cube steak was affordable, but only if you treated it right. Onions did most of the work, breaking down slowly and flavoring the gravy. Served with mashed potatoes or rice, it felt substantial without being expensive. Plates were wiped clean with bread more often than not. This dish faded as quicker cooking methods took over, but it rewarded patience in a way few meals still do. 24. Boiled potatoes with butter and salt. This doesn't sound like a meal, but it was. New potatoes were boiled whole, skins left on, then drained and split open on the plate. Butter melted into the cracks, salt sprinkled generously. This supper showed up in Tennessee homes during potato season, often alongside something small like sliced tomatoes or leftover meat. Sometimes the potato stood alone. It wasn't about variety. It was about timing. When potatoes were fresh, they didn't need help. This kind of meal disappeared because it doesn't fit modern expectations. But it filled a lot of evenings without ever calling attention to itself. 25. Leftover night suppers, done on purpose. This wasn't an accident. It was a system. Leftover night meant everything came out at once. Cold beans, sliced meat, bread, biscuits from the day before, maybe a piece of pie or cake. Plates were built, not served. In Tennessee households, this happened regularly. It gave the kitchen a break and cleared space before the next round of cooking started. People sat longer on these nights, talked more, reached instead of waited. As meals became more structured and packaged, this kind of supper lost its place. But it worked, and it made room for the next meal without waste. These Tennessee suppers aren't fading because they failed. They're fading because they belong to kitchens that cooked without clocks, without labels, and without needing permission. They were shaped by seasons, workdays, and hands that knew what to do next without thinking too hard about it. And maybe that's why we still want them back. If you remember any of these on your own table, or if one of them needs to come back into rotation, you're in good company. These meals fed more than bodies. They held households together.